Okay, let me get started here. I'm going to break this up into a couple of different videos. We're going to talk about common GIS data formats. I'll break it into raster and vector, so a couple of different videos to look at here for the lecture and the demo. I'm going to jump out of here really quick and just talk about how we're going to look at this. This is Windows Explorer, which you're all probably very familiar with, and we see a bunch of folders here that have some data inside of them. We're also going to visualize that within ARC Catalog, which is also going to show us something very similar, but we're going to see it actually as the GIS data is viewed by ARC Map and ARC Catalog. I've also got a little whiteboard, if you will, using paint. I'm going to draw a few things there towards the end of the third lecture when I talk about geodatabases. But for now, what I'm going to do is get started talking about some licensing when we talk about these common data formats. The ArcGIS licensing structure, what we now know as ArcGIS and what we use, was developed around 1999-2000. That's why I put 1999-ish, if you will, in there. And what we now know as ArcView, ArcEditor, and ArcInfo as different license levels, and we're all running ArcInfo. It's our highest level of functionality. All used to be other software or components of software. ArcView was its own standalone software before it became a license level of ArcGIS. ArcInfo was also its own standalone software, and ArcEditor was actually a module of ArcInfo. So what we now know as these different license levels were actually these standalone pieces of software that we used to use. So it used to be ArcInfo. This early version was command line driven, so I'm going to jump out of here, and if you can imagine, I'm not sure how many of you guys have used DOS, but if you just go to CMD and you get a black screen here and the computer is basically waiting for me to do something. I'm going to put dir in there to show a directory of all the files and directories within that folder that I'm looking at, the C drive users J Alvarez. So old ArcInfo was very much like this, where I would actually have to type in commands and tell it what to do. But nowadays we have our nice Windowsy environment that we're so used to. As the name would indicate, ArcInfo, Arc would be the points, lines, and polygons. That's going to be our geometry, and then the info is going to be the information behind the geometry, or the attributes, our characteristics of those different features. And there was another standalone piece of software called ArcView. So early 1990s, a more Windows-friendly version, a user-friendly version, came out that was not as powerful as ArcInfo, but was very good for mapping and analysis and querying data, making maps. And so in 1999, what Esri did was they took basically ArcView and ArcInfo and mashed it into what we basically know today as ArcGIS. So again, I've gone backwards in the slides here just to indicate ArcGIS desktop is what we're using. These are our three different levels of licensing, and of course not to be confused with ArcMap, ArcCatalog, and ArcToolbox, which are the three functional modules, if you will, that we're using as part of our exercises and assignments and working on our projects. So this is important because as we get to know different raster and vector formats, we will refer to ArcInfo and ArcView because some of the files that we're going to use are native to those different software from when they were developed back in the 80s and the 90s. So this is a slide that should look familiar to you. This is from our intro to GIS, our intro demo. And of course talking about raster data, pixels, satellite images, aerial photos, scan maps that are in a digital environment, like what we see here, are pixels, just like if we took a picture with our digital camera. Versus vectors, which deal with what we call geographic primitives, points, lines, and polygons, and the attached attributes. So again, this is a very familiar slide from one of the first lectures, and we have our characteristic information about our potential points, lines, and polygons. So we're going to take the journey here down the road of the raster format, and then I'll cut it off and we'll start another video on vectors so that these files don't get too large for putting up on YouTube. So let's start with grid. Grid is a native raster format to ArcInfo. So when ArcInfo was the main GIS software used back in the 80s and the 90s, grid is what they named their raster format. So you can see down here, BACO DEM, Baltimore County Digital Elevation Model, is what that stands for. And so there's a little icon there that indicates that this is a pixel-based piece of data, and that is digital elevation model. If I were to right click on this and open up the properties, it would tell me that the format is grid. So I'll just jump out of here really quick and look at it in ARC catalog. And there's my BACO DEM, and just to preview it in ARC catalog, I'm going to say no to building pyramids. It's a fairly small piece of data, so I'm not too concerned about displaying this data at certain resolutions. But what we're seeing here is out here in the Chesapeake Bay, we're at sea level, so those are going to be our darkest pixels, our black pixels, with a value of 0 on up to the highest elevations in the county with our very light, bright white pixels. And of course we can see at lower elevations as we go further and further down our stream valleys throughout the different parts of the county. So that's grid, and that's what a grid looks like to ARC catalog. What does it look like on disk? It looks like that. There's the Baltimore County DEM, and then there is an accompanying info folder. And just anecdotally, when we get into the vector stuff, when we talk about coverages, which is the native vector format for ArcInfo, they also use the info folder to store the information, the attribute information for vector files. But we go into these folders and we see all the yucky little files that we don't want to touch. We don't want to interact with these. And so the way our catalog looks at it and perceives it is different than the way Windows Explorer perceives it. So we want to be mindful of that. Don't want you guys corrupting your data as we go on throughout the exercises and the assignments. Raster formats that you guys are probably a little more familiar with: TIFF, JPEG, BMP, IMG, a couple other ones that I didn't put up there: GIF, GIF, or PNG, PNG. If you take a picture with your digital camera, again, you're taking basically a raster image that is in the format of JPEG, and so geographic data is no exception. We can have it in these different types of formats. So you can see three different, very different rasters here. We've got a JPEG, an IMG, and a TIFF file that represent different parts of the Baltimore region. I'm going to jump out of here and just look at this within the context of ARC catalog, and we can see the 1996 Blizzard JPEG. So when I preview that, you guys are actually getting a little sneak peek at project number 1 there. You're going to be doing something with this map and deriving some data from it and asking some questions, answering some questions. When I click on Baltimore County 321, that's a satellite image from the Landsat satellite platform. The Baltimore region, we're looking at the York Road corridor here, the 3 main reservoirs in the region: Liberty, Pretty Boy, Lock Raven Reservoir. They're all important for our drinking water supply here in the Baltimore region. A lot of the greens you see there, obviously vegetation, and then of course we're looking at either bare earth or some sort of agricultural activity, especially in the northern parts of the county. And then of course these intense grays and whites down here are going to be the downtown urban core. Essex South, a different resolution image than what we just looked at. So this is a tile of the Essex campus. There's the J building where my office is located, and several of the buildings located around campus, and of course Franklin Square Hospital next to us. So what do these files look like to Windows Explorer? Again, being mindful that these files can be made up of multiple parts. So our 3 layers are made up. In fact, our Essex South file is made up of 5 different auxiliary type files or other types of files that either give it some sort of supplemental information, or in the case of a TFW file, a world file actually puts it in the right place in space so that it lines up with our other GIS data. So we want to be very careful as we're looking at our data, both in Windows Explorer and in our catalog, that there are other parts to the data that our catalog may not necessarily show you, but are required to be able to read the data. I'm going to wrap up the raster part, the raster discussion. I don't have screenshots or any data here, but Mr. SID and ECW are 2 types of formats that are compressed, that are raster formats that you might see. And these are really used, and the third point here really illustrates that. When you have a large area and you have maybe some high resolution imagery, maybe you have imagery that each pixel is 1 foot on the surface of the earth or 6 inches, those can get pretty beefy. Those are really big files, and so a lot of times it helps to compress those. So some of the data that you might get might come in these formats, and of course they're readily readable by ArcGIS, by ArcCatalog, by ArcMap, and of course they're going to have the same raster icon that all the other formats that we just talked about have. So I'm going to jump out of here really quick, and you can pick up the next video with common vector formats, trying to keep these videos a little shorter and a little bit more manageable.